Hello, everybody. We are back for day 2 of the OpenSIPS Summit 2020 Distributed. Again, I feel it's only necessary that at the beginning of each one of these days, I profusely apologize, even though it has nothing to do with us, that we're not in Amsterdam this year. It's taken a toll on many of us. I mean, you could just look at Razvan and Liviu. They just have sadness. But that's okay. We're relieving that with another 3 presentations today. Yesterday was amazing. All the presenters did amazing jobs. Everybody had a great time. We actually had, I think it was an act of God during the raffle. Conversation between the guys over at Analyze Data and the OpenSIPS team brought to the surface a need for some integration. And one of their members, or actually one of their team members, won the 1-hour design clinic with the OpenSIPS team. So I think that was an act of God telling us we're going to see more from that. So today's presentations are going to be exciting as well. I wanted to see here if Bogdan wanted to say something at the beginning of day 2, how excited he is. You can tell on his face. All right, I guess that's all we're getting is a dance.
No, that was just the intro. Yeah. Well, yeah. Let's. We have already the day 1, which, as you said, was a good start. So now we have to continue the day 2 and face the challenge from yesterday. So yeah, I mean, the next 3 speaker will have to do it, right?
I don't think they have much of a choice.
Yep.
We will deliver.
We have a vehicle with a satellite connection parked outside of their current locations, so we're fully redundant. So today we're going to start with some keynotes from on open source telecom status, trends, and the road ahead. That's going to be with our esteemed guest, Mr. Alan Quayle. Are you here, Alan?
Yes, I am. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Okay, so without further ado, let's let Alan take us away and the start of day 2.
Excellent. Great. Well, first of all, thank you so much to Bogdan, to the OpenSIPS team, and of course the ecosystem for inviting me in to present. So just let me swap over, hopefully without too many glitches, to the presentation, and I'm just going to run through with that. So hopefully everybody can see the presentation. Yell out if you can't. Okay, I'm going to assume everybody can see it. So, as already introduced, I'm going to be presenting on the status of open source telecom software, looking at some of the trends and the road ahead. Now, what I'm going to be talking about, it's really a couple of things. I'm going to be reviewing 2 surveys that I did, one in 2019 and then a second this year. And so these results that I'm presenting here are hot off the press. Now, if you took part in the survey, I shared with you the results. You've already seen the results from the 2020 if you took part. I will be sharing them later, but I wanted to make sure that we had something new, interesting, and exciting for this presentation with the OpenSIPS team. And arising from those 2 surveys, I'm going to do some general discussion and pointers around strategy with respect to open source telecom software. So, as I'm sure some people are going, who's this Quayle guy? Was he related to an old vice president of the US? The answer is no, I'm not. But hopefully, in this slide, I could give you a little bit of information about where I come from. So I started my career at BT many, many decades ago, back in the days when telcos used to do cool stuff in telecommunications, working on broadband access, real-time communication. VoIP's been around for a hell of a long time. Also in video coding and transmission. I then moved from BT to Lucent to help with both fixed and mobile broadband. I then was very fortunate, and this was sort of a transformational piece in my career, to be the managing partner for the telco practice at Cambridge Technology Partners. They were a fixed time, fixed price Unix workshop. And that really, for me, showed that, the answer is software. The whole industry, we were coming in and we were delivering projects that were using off-the-shelf software as the complete solution. No custom hardware, no bespoke software development. We were just configuring software that was being used in the enterprise and delivering at scale. And that was quite a long time ago. I then founded the company Teltia that was in the telecom API space. We were ridiculously early to market. That ended up being sold through to Cisco, and that was back in 2003. So since then, I've been working independently, helping big companies and small companies all around new business, new services. Also do a couple of things as side hustles. One is TADHack Global, coming up on the 10th and the 11th. That's the largest telecom-focused hackathon since 2014. And the other is TADSummit. And that focuses around programmable communications. And we try to be sort of a fair, independent event, really focused on all the companies out there that aren't wrapped up in all the Bay Area bullshit. So if you hear me go BABS, that's what I'm referring to. So just to summarize, I'm an independent chartered engineer who, well, at the moment, virtually wanders the world, helping people around new business, new services, and pointing out all the bullshit that sits out there. So that's the background. Let's get into what we're going to be talking about. Now, this slide, I know this is, for a lot of the people on the call, it's like, yeah, I knew this. But for most of the people that I talk to in the communications industry, in the telecoms industry, they are not aware of the vast scale of open source communication projects that are out there. Some are aware of FreeSwitch, Asterisk, and then when I show all the other projects, the vast ecosystem that is in place, it shocks them. Also, when I start sharing the numbers around the impact all these projects have had on the communications ecosystem, the communications industry, again, it's one of the sort of people. I mean, OpenSIPS is an example of a project that's fundamentally changing a $2 trillion industry that isn't aware of the project. Now, there's, I draw this as an analogy so people understand just how significant these projects are. The telecom app server is analogous to the web server. So you've got a client, talks to a web server, and then it just goes out and gathers all the data and services that are out there on the internet. And 80% of web servers are open source, Apache or Nginx. And it's very analogous to what we see in telecoms. Telecom app server basically talks out to all the telecom protocols and networks and all the services that exist out not only on the PSTN, but the internet as well. So in some ways, it's as complex as a web server, and it has been fundamentally shifting the industry. So I just wanted to draw the analogy that telecom as app server is as important as the web server, because guess what? Communications is fundamental to the human condition. I wanted to do a architecture slide because this is not a technical presentation, but just so we can set in context how programmable communications fits with all the acronyms that we sit out there. So at the bottom of the stack, we've got the telcos, we've got the internet. On top of that, we've got aggregation, whether it be voice, messaging, RCS, telephone numbers, SIMs, data, charging, mobile ID. There's a whole vast repository of information across the PSTN. Of course, SBCs, firewalls, because on top of that, you've got the telecom app server for the traditional PSTN, the SIP app server for all SIP services, and of course, WebRTC app server gateway for all the stuff that's WebRTC related. And of course, quite often, it's a common app server that cuts across all three aspects. And then on top of that, all the value-added services. So all the bots, fax still exists, speech rec, push to talk, two-factor authentication, media forking, call recording, you name it. There's a whole range of value-added services that sit and run on those telecom app servers and work across a range of media. There's, of course, API management, because that's how a lot of those services and capabilities get exposed. Rest today, but it's evolving. We should never, and that's one thing that in my career, don't take today's situation as in any way other than ephemeral. It's moving, it's constantly evolving. We're not at an endpoint in the industry. We're just at a step along a long road ahead. I remember thinking back at the end of the 90s that SS7 would be disappearing soon. Well, here we are, 20 years later, and SS7 is still alive and well. Sitting on top of all that stack are all the enterprise enablers and services. So like Twilio Flex, which is basically 90-odd% of a contact center. Also unified communication as a service, unified communication collaboration, all the workflow, task management, all these enterprise services are sitting under this stack. And of course, we also got to mention all those common functions, usage and billing being very important piece of how we all make money. But it's just wanted to highlight that across this communications experience technology or programmable communications, open source projects are the fundamental enabler and have been for what is now, given some of the projects started 20 years ago, a 20-year-old change. Now, it's tough being in open source telecom software. It's not like being in open source in the web or the internet. We've got a $2 trillion ecosystem there. And the two major components of it, the telcos and the vendors, are sat on vast stores of cash. But have they supported all these open source telecom ecosystems? Do they do what we see with IBM, Google, Amazon, Red Hat, etc., in supporting these open source projects that you see on the web and the internet? And the question is, well, not really. They do use them, and a lot of telcos use open source projects, use OpenSIPS as an example. Do they talk about it? Do they promote their usage? Absolutely not. A lot of
freaking bastards.
A lot of vendors. I can quote several examples where an open source project discovered that their project was being used because the telco who was using the open source project contacted them for support, but it was actually delivered through a particular vendor. I'm not going to name names, but just so we understand the challenges that exist in open source telecom software. But even given those challenges, it has significantly changed the whole industry, which is a testament to the dedication and the skills of all the people working across open source telecom software. Now, I just want to say one slide just to say this is just my perspective. It's okay to disagree with me. A lot of people do. So this is just my perspective. And if you have questions, please, we can take them at the end. Just hang on a sec, sorry. I had my phone on silent, but it's coming through on Google. So it was hassling me on the laptop as well. So I've got two surveys I'm going to be reviewing. I'm going to do a little bit of recapitulation on what I did last year. Again, there's a link. You can get all the details from the survey. It's all published. I'm going to give you some hot off the press results for what we did in 2020. 2021 was really filling in some gaps. It's one of those that, we did the survey in 2019 and then realized, damn, forgot to ask this. Damn, this wasn't clear. Damn, it's you do it and then you realize all your mistakes. So we sort of did 2020 as a correction. Plus, we missed quite a few important projects. Draccio, RTP engine. So we sort of 2020 is a bit of a plus really trying to understand some questions that arose out of 2019. So we had 95 responses. This just shows how many responses included feedback on all the different projects. So as you can see, Asterix, as you would imagine, it's the longest running and had the most, but you can see 51 responses on OpenSIPS. It's a testament to its popularity. I'm just going to show some OpenSIPS results, just so you understand the content of the survey. So this was asking, what are the applications where you use OpenSIPS? Gives you a range of different applications there. Also, what's the scale? As you would imagine, one of the things that OpenSIPS does very well is enabling stuff to run at scale. So you can see the scale of deployments there. We also, it's an independent survey, so we asked about the strengths and the weaknesses of the projects. And you get to see that across all the different projects. It's all published. Just go to that link. And you can see the strengths there, as well as some of the weaknesses, which is great in just providing that frank feedback to help understand how to improve and build on the project. And don't worry, documentation is common to every project. Also, we asked questions around the future. How do people view the future? And again, I give the number of people that provided feedback, so you get a feel for not only how popular was the question, but how many responses were, so how significant to take the feedback. So of course, remain dominant or will become the dominant VoIP infrastructure project. And of course, part of what we do with this survey is we allow people to just put, in any of the questions, they can just put down stuff that they think is important around particular topics. And this, in the blue box, I think is an interesting point that was made in terms of OpenSIPS is an ideal tool for VoIP infrastructure backbones. While we see with UCaaS, there was going to be increased competition in some of those projects from a lot of the, as a service providers, OpenSIPS, because of its focus around infrastructure, whether it be SBCs, trunking, carriers, is going to be around for a significant period of time. So again, it's nice that we can get these pieces of feedback to help, compare and contrast how people view the different projects. Then I'm going to quickly run through these. This is just so you compare the different projects that are out there in terms of, accessibility of the developer community, how easy it is to engage with the community, how do you find ease? Oh, well, actually, let me just point on this previous slide. This is just to say that across Quayle and OpenSIPS, there's lots of love. So I think those are two examples of two very well-run open source projects. We also asked around how easy is it to find consultants? Now, in this year, 2020, we went into more detail around geography to understand, given the different geographies of the people involved, how do they find it easy or difficult to find consultants? So we're going to come into those results in a little bit. So out of all this, some of the takeaways from 2019 were Ansible's the answer to configuration management. Most projects are using it. A question, of course, raised was, should we, publish some of the popular scripts? I used to do software development. I don't anymore. When I try to play around, all I can describe it as hideously frustrating, as it just reminds me how inept I've become. Scripts remove some of my frustration. So wherever you can do to basically enable me to type in just a couple of lines and then magic happens is beautiful. One of the things that I found quite interesting from the survey was native cloud for a lot of deployments is not a popular choice. Now, at TADSummit last year, we had quite a few fintech people there, as well as, of course, all the programmable telecoms community. And there was quite an interesting sort of difference of opinion when some of the programmable telecoms guys were sharing their deployments and some of the issues they faced. The fintech guys looked on and went, oh my God, guys, are you still yak shaving? Just use serverless. So it was interesting to see the sort of the difference in adoption between those two. And what we've done for 2020 is we've asked some more questions around serverless adoption, some of the issues around serverless adoption. And we've spent a lot more time understanding the geographical differences. And this is going to play back when I start at the end, wrapping up around some of the strategic issues facing the open source telecom community. But just to wrap up from the 2019 survey, there's still a hell of a lot. There's a long road ahead of us around accelerating open source adoption. Even though, within the open source community, it looks like everybody's there. When we look more broader across different verticals, there's a hell of a lot of work to do in front of us. So moving on to what we did this year in 2020. So one of the questions we asked is, where's the core of your team based? So we're really trying to get a better understanding of, in terms of the responses, the geography. So as you can see, of course, no surprise, North America is top, but India, and we see definitely India becoming a very important region, not necessarily in terms of the deployments, but in terms of the projects or the organizations or the teams that are using open source telecom software. As you would imagine, Germany, but all the countries in and around Europe, Fraunhofer Focus is almost like a tour of duty you must do before you launch your open source telecom project. UK, of course, Australia, New Zealand. So you can see there, Canada. There's a lot of English-speaking countries here. Again, because a lot of the documentation is in English. It shows that there's an issue to be addressed. When I look at WebRTC, because its backer is the evil organization known as Google, they can afford to do a lot more translation. I look at, for example, South Korea, and they have a big, vibrant WebRTC ecosystem. And why? Well, they have a lot of documentation in the native language. So it really does help to have that, but it's expensive and it's difficult to do. So I just highlight that that's one of a number of gaps to help in really making this software available to developers all around the world. Now, back to that point I raised about what are the challenges? As you saw, finding knowledgeable consultants was an issue. But now let's break it down and look at regionally. What are the top issues? So if we look at Europe and North America, the issue is finding knowledgeable consultants. And it's not just knowledgeable around a particular project. It's also in having deep understanding around SIP. So it was a comment that was made in several of the sort of other sections. It's it's not just in OpenSIPS or in FreeSwitch. It's having somebody that understands these projects and has the depth of SIP understanding that we require. Then when we start looking at some of the other regions, India, Australia, speed of response in Russia, and also Central South America, it was language barriers. And then for distributed teams, so this is where there's they're distributed across a number of countries around the world, and Middle East, speed of response was highlighted. So then when we look at, when we look at difficulty around hiring, here there wasn't so much a geographic difference. It was just showing which of the projects where people are having challenge hiring. As you would imagine, with the smaller projects, all the newer projects, less so at the moment. But again, it's just also influenced by the number of people that respond to the survey as well. On language barriers, we asked, how can we fill that in? And documentation in local language was top. And documentation really requires an expert. In a lot of projects, I know there's somebody that can write relatively good prose. Let's use them for getting the documentation out. It's I can't emphasize enough having somebody that can professionally write good documentation transforms how easy it is to use your software. Also, when it comes to translation, again, having somebody that has the skills that can help in the translation. I run a weekly newsletter, CX Tech newsletter, and in that a couple of weeks ago, I had a link to an article that was published by Infobit, and they were discussing how they deal with localization of their documentation for the different APIs around the world and the process that they use. Now, I know well, they've got a boatload of cash at the moment, but and I know it's difficult for a lot of open source projects, but documentation is a critical capability, and also it is an essential piece of your marketing. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. On speed of response, okay, if it's important, are you prepared to pay? So it was interesting to look again across the different regions. For Americas, it wasn't seen as an issue. While for India, Middle East, Australia, New Zealand, ANZ, it was seen as more of an issue. Europe was interesting. There was a spread. So I guess it depends where what projects you're using. And also the bias in terms of responses. We had more people from Europe than every other region responding to the survey. They were an average of 3, but it spread across. And then looking at how do you contribute, as you would imagine, the usual 80-10 split in terms of people who want to contribute versus people who just ride on the back of your project. Majority method being commit code, paying for code development, donating money, attending events. And I think the reason you see attending events being relatively low on this is, well, this was asked during COVID-19. Other topic we covered is looking at redundancy of implementations. And we just had a long list last year. What we were able to do this year is to prioritize it. Because of time, I'll just skip over this rather than going into highlighting any issues. But hey, as you can see, OpenSIPS proxy came out top in terms of support for redundancy. On serverless, this was interesting. Again, there's a lot of questions that were asked. I'm just giving you a highlight. No plans was the top response. Evaluating next, then we had 9 responses in already implementing, then plans, there was only 7. And there was a couple of don't cares. We're seeing a very cautious approach to serverless across the open source community. And we're going to be discussing that in more detail at TADSummit in November. We're bringing together some interesting characters to have a discussion around that. We then asked, what topics should we address in 2021 if we did this survey? First was security. It's a gap. We've not discussed it at all in the previous 2 surveys. And in fact, at TADSummit, we have Ole presenting on security as always being basically the sort of thing you do after any project. Repeat the broader survey, more detailed questions on the platforms, more telco stuff, looking at the role of open source software in IMS, 5G standalone, ask about API-related features being used inside of Asterisk and what people are experiencing. So again, rather than the sort of high-level questions that we asked back in 2019, getting into some more specific questions associated with each of the projects. Asked to track serverless adoption over time. Also, can we get more web developer perspective? That was seen as a weakness in the surveys, as it's just really mostly getting feedback from open source project experts, trying to see across web developers how they view the projects and making it annual and tracking over time with some of the feedback. Also, if you have any questions, if you see any gaps, please just let me know. I'm easy to get on contact with, and we can add those in for 2021. So those were the surveys. I apologize, I'm running a little bit over, but strategy won't take too long. Let's get on to that. Now, I'm not saying this is anything to do with OpenSIPS. It's just, I see some open source projects are a little, shall we say, exclusive in their behavior. It's important to realize that you're not cults. Being open is critical. The leader or the leading organization is not always right. Critical thinking is important. That's how you get better. And I've seen certain ostracizing behavior once you're no longer part of that club. So I'd say there is a tendency to behave like a clique. It's important not to be as open and as inclusive as possible. As I said, this doesn't apply to OpenSIP, but I just wanted to state it. But when we look at open source projects, they are both a product, that's the code, and you need to treat it like a product. And there are a whole range of surprised me from the survey, and we asked this is, what are the services you provide around the open source project? And this is just a tip of a massive iceberg. Training, development, design, maintenance of VoIP networks and services, a whole range of different consulting services, providing managed hosted VoIP networks and services, installation, customization, high availability, scalability setups, and telecom consulting. So there's lots of different ways in which the teams are making money to put food on the table, because giving stuff away for free is great in terms of making you feel as if you're making a difference, but unfortunately it doesn't necessarily put food on the table. So this shows an important piece and just how varied the different sources of revenue are for the projects. Now, when you start looking at those, at the product, it's important to understand, well, who are the customers that we're addressing? Because that influences all aspects of strategy. Now, of course, we've talked about the traditional telcos and the vendors and the challenge that they're sat on basically big piles of cash, and they've not really been that supportive of the open source telecom community. Now, I'm not saying don't work with them. If you can, that's great. They have deep pockets, but do it opportunistically, because if you make this a core piece of your business, they can basically, I refer to it as being meetinged to death. They can keep you basically sort of on the possibility of your project closing for a year, 18 months, and that can bust small companies. So it's opportunistic if you know you can close it soon. We then have the Bay Area bullshit providers. So they're all the ass organizations. It's a mature segment. They have deep expertise, and they tend to fork a project once their objectives are achieved, simply to de-risk, so that they can go on and maintain and run with that code base and develop it as required. And to be honest, most of the accounts are settled there. Now, of course, if you've got like a ring central knocking on your door and saying, what, we'd like to discuss with you, using you for a SIP router, of course you say yes, because the size of the projects are so damned big. But doing things more systematically, there are a whole range of regional UC contact center providers. GoContact is an example. They're maturing and they're looking for solutions to help them in competing against the Bay Area providers. So there's a segment that it's easier to work with, long-term relationships. Now, of course, I get asked a lot of questions around enterprise. My response is always, it's expensive to reach. Now, Matrix, they closed a great deal with the French government, and then not long after that with a big piece of the German government. So if you can get them, again, yes, opportunistically, but it's expensive. And there's a lot of competition from the providers that are just providing solutions, not technology. Then next generation telcos, MVNOs, alternate access providers. So Simwood being an example. They're expanding into more and more telecom services. And guess what? They're expanding their business because they treat their customers like customers rather than items on a balance sheet. Now, initially, they can support the projects, but then as they scale, they don't have the time or energy to be doing a lot of stuff that you can then provide as services to them. So again, it's an investment that enables you for future revenues to grow. And then this segment, and this is a tough one, I agree, but I see it as a growing area. There are a whole range of targeting enterprises all around the world, integrators, value-added resellers, managed service providers. ScanSource is an example. They tend to be more web-centric, but they're struggling. And some of the integrators have resold, for example, BroadSoft in the past, but now that's part of Cisco. The pricing sucks. And also there's a lot of competition from the as-a-service providers. So they need an alternative, and open source provides that answer. I mean, part of the struggle they have is being able to get access to it in a web-centric, web-friendly way. So here are some of the segments to help you in terms of focusing, where to grow your business. And the key piece when you're looking at that product and service is the marketing. Now, I would say most open source projects have done an excellent job in marketing to other open source telecom engineers. And of course, you start where there's people that and you've got relationships with. So that's been done very well. Grow this business, there needs to be more diversity. And the big area I see in helping address that isn't necessarily doing sort of generic marketing to enterprises or integrators. It's actually around documentation, examples, training, code samples, all done in a web-centric way. Two prime examples: Twilio, Google. My son, he spent this summer learning and playing with Scratch through Google's Computer Science First. Google is training the next generation of software engineers. So, and they, people just are, developers' expectations are set by what they experience with Google, with Amazon, and Twilio. One of the keys to its success is just delivering it with web-centric way with all the above. I see that as a gap, and the quickest, well, not quickest, but it's I think a step that can help a lot of open source projects achieve a far broader addressable market through making their documentation more accessible with lots of examples, training, code samples. So just to wrap up, it's a global community of communities. It's vast. People don't realize how vast open source telecom or communication software community are. And it's almost everywhere. 80% of CX tech companies rely on open source telecom software. At Astrocon, I was talking about that last year. It's a $2 trillion market that's being democratized thanks to open source. All those as a service providers I mentioned, it's open source telecom software that's helped them make their business possible. But it's hard. Legacy ecosystem hasn't been supported, even though it's critical to their future success. They're trapped in legacy, unfortunately. As I discussed, OpenSIPS is well positioned in this evolving market, being on the infrastructure side, looking out, and being able to help a whole range of projects. Key is the need to globalize. You saw the importance of India in the survey, but there's the rest of Asia, there's the Middle East, Russia, Central and Latin America. And to address them, it's adopting web best practices around the documentation. You need an expert. May only be contract, and I know it's expensive and it's difficult for a lot of open source projects, but making that investment, pays dividends. Also having examples, code samples, cut and paste programming is the greatest type of programming and training. One of the reasons why Asterisk has been so successful is because of all the training it provides to so many integrators, VARs, and MSPs around the world. And because India is so important, I have to use a cricket analogy. So the way to look at it is we've just completed the first innings of telecom open source software. That's the first 20 years. There's still at least 3 more innings to go. That's 60 years. So looking at the work that we're doing here, we're still going to be discussing OpenSIPS in 20, 40, and perhaps even 60 years' time, when most of the people here, well, people in my age group anyway, will be long dead and buried. But that's my piece. Thanks for listening. I just want to mention again, TADHack Global is on the 10th and 11th of October. It's the largest communications-focused hackathon in the world since 2014. Please get involved. Mass up your project or any services with the global sponsors. We have web developers from all around the world hacking on the sponsors. So it's a great way to get your projects out there, to make people aware of all the cool stuff that's possible with your work. So again, thanks so much for listening. Any questions?
Thank you, Alan. That was awesome.
You're welcome.
Wow, man, you covered quite a bit in just a little bit of time. I'm very impressed.
Thank you.
And it's really great to get something sobering like this, to have it, somebody that's taking the time to research it. And most of us on this side, I think, developers, integrators, whichever category you fall into, we don't get a chance to really step outside and see this. I think that was extremely informative for everybody.
Thank you.
Let's take some questions. Do we have any moderators ready with some questions?
Well, I would have some if there's, but I will let's say let's take first from the audience if we have any. I see there is
There
a
is one.
question from
Yep.
Artem.
Yeah. So Artem says some telcos cannot tell officially that they use open source software because there's laws that exist in some countries that don't allow them to. What do you think is going to change there, or how do you think we can change that?
Yep. A lot of times they're lying. It'll be because of our regulator. They blame other stuff for not trying. Got to bear in mind that most people who work in telcos aren't focused in doing their job. They're focused in surviving long enough to retire. So as a result, don't rock the boat. So you've got to understand there's a lot of dysfunctionality that exists. Now, let's face it, Simwood, they're beholden to a lot of the same regulation that the telcos have. Also bear in mind there are a lot of different types of telcos out there, and Simwood is an active member of many projects and talks about it and contributes and has those members presenting at its customer events. So when it's doing SimCon, it's a customer event. It's got lots of customers there, and it's promoting the projects that it's using and talking about how it uses them. So I'd say I understand the question. I think that there is a certain amount of cultural issues, and they talk quite happily about Ericsson closing a $5 billion 10-year deal, or Samsung. We recently saw a $4 billion deal with Verizon. So it's like, well, help me understand. With this big brand, they've just announced ridiculous numbers that may or may not actually over the period of that deal close. And they just can't talk about, or acknowledge even that they're using OpenSIPS. So I'd say that there's a culture issue. The regulator, to be honest with you, couldn't care about whether using open source software or not. A lot of telcos like Verizon have a policy that if you want to buy software, you have to fill in a form. It's a lot of telco about why you're not using open source software. So again, there's an example where with telco, I think their policy is pro open source, but these small projects need, so desperately to just for telcos to share how those projects are being used, because they're herds. They want to take the safe choice. Nobody gets fired for buying IBM. Well, today you might be, but if you've got some of the big guys that are using OpenSIPS, that just encourages so many of the tier 2, tier 3 telcos that are out there to say, hey, if it's good enough for Vodafone, if it's good enough for AT&T, it's good enough for me. So again, I'd say it's a cultural issue. We as an industry need to raise that and keep banging the drum on the lack of support from both the telcos and the vendors in supporting open source, which is responsible for the bulk of the innovation that's happened over the last decade in communications in telecoms.
I think we got one more question. Thank you very much. That was an awesome response. And I do think, like you said, it has a lot to do with the culture. Greed being one of them. Yeah.
Big sacks of cash.
Yeah.
I just look at the $150 a month that goes from my account to T-Mobile. And there's very few companies that I pay monthly that size of bill for services to. And I'm like, somebody sat on a ton of cash here.
For sure. For sure. Especially as small guys, we know what it actually takes to run a customer.
You got it.
So the percentages, or rather the scale of revenue or profit that we see here on their level, it's unimaginable. Somebody
Exactly.
Get the helicopter set. Let's drop some money. So John Farmer, he had a question. He said, can the spread of OSS help the quality for small carriers? It's been his experience that small providers have much worse quality, mostly on the media side.
Yeah, and that's a very good question. Well, first of all, yes, it can. Absolutely. The challenge has been with some of the small telcos, the small providers, is their exec team tend to come from the telecoms industry, and they expect an Ericsson or a Nokia, or now they're working in a smaller provider that isn't in North America. Maybe we'll take Huawei, and Huawei reuses some software that project. So it's a structural issue in trying to buy from telecoms, the large traditional legacy telecoms providers. Is how you ensure you stay in the job. That's the reality of it. Okay, and that's why I highlight SIMWord and all the other alternate access providers, that because they don't have those budgets, because they don't have that legacy thinking, quite often they come from other industries. They've been an ISP, or they've been like an enterprise VAR, based out of Indonesia, that then realize that they can provide a whole range of services thanks to the wholesale capability of their telco, and wrap it with a great set of services. So they've taken a different approach, a more enterprise-centric approach. So again, it's a very slow change. But again, as I said, this is a long-run game. We're only 20 years in to open source telecom software. We've still got at least another 60 years to go. All the people here will mostly be dead and buried, and they'll still be talking about it and its adoption across telcos around the world. So I agree, it can impact. It's a cultural change, and that takes years, decade plus.
I got a question.
Thank you.
Hey, Alan, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation.
Thank you,
And yeah, I think you're doing a very good job with that survey. It's definitely very detailed and very well sorted out. I just got a remark on one of your slides where you said you're going to include some questions about specifics of particular projects, like asterisk and stuff. I think in that regard, you probably, if you can find some way to delegate that to projects themselves to help you to define.
Yes.
So you should probably be talking to OpenSIPS guys and asterisk guys and whoever else to get what is questions they would like to.
Exactly. And I will be providing, I think for next year, we'll have to, ask some questions in terms of, what are some of the topics you want asked in the survey? Because what I did this year is I drafted the survey based on what we said at the end of last year. And of course, you know how it is, you send it all out for feedback, and, nobody responded. Until, basically I sort of poked people, and it is hard. I mean, every open source project is different because it's all about the people. There's, the cultures across the different projects are very diverse. It's like everybody, we're all different, and all the projects are different. Some go, what are you asking me marketing shit for? Our project's great, our documentation is great, we're all great, just leave us alone. There's an insular nature in some projects, others are open. But I will, as a process, when we put the questions together, make sure for each of the projects we get feedback. And also I'd recommend you send, hey, here's the outline, here are the suggested questions for this survey. Go to your community and ask what matters to you, so that we can get your ecosystem helping and steering the questionnaire so it delivers the most value. Because the reason I'm doing this is I just saw a gap. I just want to get, to share the understanding, to help persuade all the people outside of the open source community to understand how vast and successful it is, and to help the community in addressing the gaps to close with particular segments of the market that maybe are underserved today. So great advice, and definitely
Excellent.
I'll be taking
Thank you
that
very
on.
much. Yeah, we're looking forward
Thank
to
you.
work with you.
Bogdan and Shlomi, I think both of you had some questions.
Yeah, actually, I have two of them. Try to, let's say, one it's more like a philosophical one, and the other one it's more like realistic or
Give it to us, so great.
day question. Yeah. Let's start with the philosophical one. I feel inspired. It's more about the open source model, because at least in my opinion, I think during in these years, the whole open source world goes to kind of a identity crisis. In terms of, if you think where the open source started from, it's just at the end of the day a license governing how the code is distributed. That was maybe like, I don't know, 20, 30, whatever years ago. And right now we are talking completely different about different things. I mean, it's not code only. You know, we have huge projects involving so many people. As Alan said, trying to produce documentation, trying to help, I mean, to make the whole code usable, offering, you know, help to the users. I mean, through different kind of chats, mailing lists, and so on, so on. So from this perspective, I would say that the old traditional open source model, it's a bit like outdated. I mean, it needs to be improved in order to cover everything. I mean, this is related to like you know, again, what you said, Alan, about companies using and not helping anything. I mean, this doesn't have to be a. I mean, an open source project. It's not something that you simply take. I mean, it shouldn't be something that you simply take and that's it. People should think like, okay, I'm using this, you know, crappy software, but at the end of the day, if I end up including in whatever I'm doing, I'm relying on it. So, you know, thinking wise, I should put something back, you know, because it's at the end of the day, you know, this collective work should not be limited to the code itself, but you know, extended to the project level. And I think that's a big misunderstanding. You know, people, they do think, okay, code is free. They extrapolate and then everything is free. So including like you have to stay there 24 hours to solve their goddamn problem. You know, doesn't really matter if you have something else to do or not. But, you know, it's an open source project, so you know they are entitled to grab your whole life for that. In the same time, you know, nobody has no kind of an obligation, not even, I mean, I'm not saying like a written license, but even moral obligation to say, yeah, you know what, you know, we should do also something to contribute, because at the end of the day, we are all in the same boat, right?
Correct.
It's not like just a producer and a consumer. You know, we are just working together. So
exactly, there's that whole ecosystem, and the power of an open source ecosystem is it has on-ramps for everybody. So I could be, you know, a geek working in an enterprise CIO, and you know, we're on, you know, we're basically sort of we're looking at different options for a innovative contact center that has special requirements given the customers that we serve. And I'm looking at, you know, Talkdesk doesn't do it, Avaya is ridiculously expensive, Cisco, forget it. And we're looking at, well, how much would it cost to, you know, for us to make this project happen? So, you know, that's an on-ramp. You've got large, you know, sort of vendors that are using this because they've got a skills gap, they've got a technology gap. Yet this fits in, and I agree. I see the big gap. It's a moral gap. In people go, you know, it's anonymous. You know, it's like, yeah, it's software, download, woohoo, bye-bye, thank you, you know? You know, and to be honest, some of the big guys have done that. They forked the code and now they're independent. And that's why your community events are so important, because part of it is people knowing people. And let's face it, you know, from the 2020 survey, there's a vast array of services that are provided by the organizations around the code. So I think, you know, I agree there needs to be an evolution of the model. I think, you know, part of it is, you know, because when people know people, there will still people who will cheat you, even though they know you. But when there's a human connection, there, you know, people understand, I need to put bread on the table. Come on, you know, I'm helping you, you help me. So I think there's more of a quid pro quo when there's more people relationships. And I think as an overall community of communities, building those relationships and also being far more explicit around the moral contract. Because I think what you're highlighting is how can, you know, we're providing this, you know, open source software. It's you know, free license use it any way you want, and people can take advantage. I think part of it is, and people will. There's no way around. You saw in that survey, that 85-15% people have no idea, have no interest in committing back to the project, but 85% want to commit back. And it's that classic Pareto analysis. It's just not enforcing, but making clear the social contract that you're expecting, so that it avoids any animosity. Because I do see in some projects there's a certain animosity to particular organizations or people because they feel they've been taken advantage of. And just having that, clear, open, and communicated, I think can resolve a lot of this. So as an overall ecosystem, you're getting a bigger bite of the cake, because people just feel morally obligated. Some won't, but the vast majority will. So as an overall ecosystem, it grows. So I understand the philosophical issue. I think part of it is around communication and just being very clear around the expectations from being part of the community.
That's true. Thank you, Alan.
Yeah.
And,
I think another problem might be just generational. Like those big telecoms are usually run by business people who never heard of open source software, probably.
Correct.
And I really don't think they teach this in business schools even these days. So a lot of future leaders might have the same problem because they don't understand the nature of this contract. So it's really hard to
But again,
explain.
that comes back to education. Oh, sorry, go for it.
Right. You are saying that's why it's important to make a statement, is say exactly what you require for example, even business people.
Yes.
To
exactly. Because often at a technical level, it's done, but it's translating it into people who sign the POs. So that's part of the challenge, is just, and again, part of it is just having written down, making it clear and saying it again and again and again. It doesn't matter that you are bored by having to say it. I can guarantee there are a lot of people out there who haven't heard what you're saying. So again, your part of marketing is just repeating the same message again and again and again in slightly different forms.
Yeah. And the second question is not like a question. It's more like a, let's say, a hint for the next survey.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, it should be interesting to see. Okay, each, as I used to say, each project has its dark side, or a dark counterpart. I mean, all the projects usually are like a binary solar system. You have the project, and then you have on the other side, orbiting one around, some kind of business entity trying to keep things alive.
Yeah.
Because as you said, at the end of the day, you have to put the bread on the table.
Yeah.
Now the question, because last year we saw quite a shifting in these relations. I mean, there was the whole story with the asterisk and Digium, then about the free switch and signal wire and so on and so on. So that will be an interesting question, let's say, to see, to find out what are the most, let's say, popular, if I can call it like this, models, like relation between the two. Because you see, in the old times, basically, Digium was completely in control of Asterisk, so they were like the big guys in the back controlling. Last year with the free switch was more or less a bit different. I mean, there was the project, and then in the shadow of the project, boom, you had the signal wire rising. So again, that will be something interesting
and that reflects
to have there.
To an extent in the 2019 survey. We look at your developer engagement and how people feel about the projects when you compare Quayle and OpenSIPS to Asterisk and free switch. You can see there's a very marked difference around developer perception. I've tried to tread a little lightly here because I don't want to piss people off, because I know it gets very sensitive, but
lightly.
Yeah, I tread lightly.
It's worse than the ladies.
Oh yes, absolutely. There's just way too much emotion, But I understand what you're saying. I think I just try to be independent. I try to ask questions that could reflect that without getting into needling or specific points that people could get sensitive about. So I understand what you're asking. All I can say is I will put whatever we do, we'll put out for review before we release it as a survey, so that people have a chance to give feedback.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Alan. Great.
You're welcome.
Great
Thank you so
discussion,
much.
great presentation.
Shlomi, we have one more question. Shlomi
Yeah.
Gutman has been waiting patiently.
Okay.
Usually I'm not a patient guy, but just a quick question about, as you said, I think one of the biggest gap is about the security perspective that companies getting into open source. And the question is, for me, is what do you think we as a community should do better about getting a better perspective about open source security? Like, should we do a better shaming for our bugs? Or because also a lot of people like not aware of upgrades and the needs of getting upgrades, and there is a lot of gap between how secure are open source in the newer version of how unsecure are the old. And I think there is a big awareness problem for both sides. And what do you think as a community we should do about it?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. Security has to be at the start. And we actually have a presentation from Ole Johansson around security, some of the issues that he cares about. I think it is as an industry, so by working together across the different projects, showing the processes, showing how the gaps are plugged and plugged to dam site faster than closed source solutions. Because again, there's a lot of perception issues around, open source because it's open. There's more, there's more risk. But actually, guess what? Because it's open, as soon as a gap's discovered, it gets plugged by the community and is released. When a closed source could be 6 months, 9 months, a year later. So I think there's use cases. I think more explicitly communicating how security is built in from the start. In this release, here are the security issues that we've addressed. So people understand that in your projects, security is a big piece that's designed from the get-go. So again, it comes back to education, but definitely, I think more communication, and definitely with the new releases, highlighting the plug, what gaps have been plugged, both publicly, but also, there's certain gaps that get plugged that are more private, that is within the community or with some members of the ecosystem. So, there's ways of tiering it so that people feel confident that they're actually deploying something that, is far better than they could buy commercially off the shelf.
And isn't that really like kind of a two-way street too? Because the more open that you are, the more apparent it is that there are security issues. It kind of like works against you and for you at the same time.
Correct. Absolutely. But, it's one of those where, if you've got it, I can bet you there's a whole host of other projects that do. I mean, let's face it, we've seen some, security issues with some of the biggest cloud providers in the telecom space. And they have their own proprietary stack that they've built up. They may have been based on open source initially, but as they've grown and evolved and they got bucket loads of cash, they're now able to build out their own project. And even there's gaps. So there will always be security issues. We can't get around it. I think the key is it's, again, being open with the use cases and showing how security is designed in from the start with the projects on each release. It's there, and it's a key theme as part of the communication. Not just all the functionality and all the cool standards and all the lovely geeky techie stuff, but showing how this core piece is addressed in every release, every increment that comes out in the software.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alan. Thanks everybody for the awesome questions. This was actually an awesome presentation with some two-way feedback.
Thank you.